Welcome everyone to our student section for NCSA, the North Central Sociological Association's Fall Conference Session for 2022. Our topic this semester is decolonizing the academic branding process. And so what we mean by academic branding is how you are creating a name for yourself in your particular field and in your area and all the different parts and components that go into that. As we were having a discussion, we thought that there were a lot of normative ways that we do that. And given that we all have some form of a minoritized status, we wanted to talk about ways to decolonize that in really important ways that offer us other options and alternatives while also allowing us to show up authentically as ourselves and still allowing us space to be able to thrive in academia. So I'll start us off. So as I mentioned, the discussion about internalized oppression and how we navigate marginalized spaces as marginalized people is really important, as well as the impact of daily habits and main habits that you keep for yourself. And so I'm pulling from David and Derthik, their book or their article, excuse me, What is Internalized Oppression and So What? And so they use a model that was actually designed by Fanon in 1965 that talks a little bit about how internalized oppression becomes a reality. And so I think that will kind of set the stage for how and why it's important to decolonize the academic branding process. So the first step that they offer is there's a forced entry and dissolution of indigenous land. Specifically, we think about settler colonialism and folks coming in, destroying land, destroying everything, and then also taking away indigenous folks' access to the land that has been theirs for their lifetime. Secondly, they destruct indigenous culture, their social norms and customs, and then in return, they reconstruct those in the image of the colonizer specifically, so that there is this, your culture is no longer valuable, our culture is now valuable. The third is really instilling this idea that colonization was meant for the purpose of civilization of the community, the indigenous culture, and it was for their benefit, right? That you are better off now that we have come in and civilized you in a particular way that was not present before. And then last, institutionalizing the colonization in the form of schools, churches, et cetera. And oftentimes this is done by those who were the indigenous culture that was there originally. So what that means is that no longer is it just the colonizer coming in and enforcing a particular norm. Now they have gotten buy-in from the indigenous community to also maintain this particular type of colonization. So when you think about daily habits, scholars have long argued that much of our behaviors that we do on a regular basis kind of explain and help to understand how we show up in space. And so I've got a few references there, of course, but I wanted to point out just a couple of things that help with the academic branding process. So it could be everything from your email signature. A lot of people will put quotes and things like that. And some of those quotes speak to kind of the political identity or the ideology of the person that you are emailing. Your dress, right, in terms of whether or not you follow certain norms or not. And so I think about this particularly in a gendered context, which can be really powerful. Your stated politics and attitudes, so towards the academy, towards students. There are those faculty who are notorious for not wanting to work with students, and then there are those that do want to work with students. And in general, your attitude towards academia. Do you think that it is more so your goal to stick with conversing with the ivory tower, or do you have more of an interest in making your work public and accessible and meaningful to different communities outside of academia? Use of language and accent. I know that the group of us here have talked a lot about, and I have talked a lot about being a country girl and how I have learned to embrace that as I think about how I show up in academia and in different spaces, and not apologizing for my particular story and being born and raised in Appalachia. A couple of main things that more people might think have a larger impact that influence your brand. So the scholars that you're in conversation with, literally or metaphorically, right? So when your name comes up, who else is being mentioned as part of that as well? You know, who are you known for associating with? Of course, and this is where it gets a little sticky, but bringing it back to the internalized oppression piece, your educational background and pedigree. right? The way that folks look at someone who graduated from Princeton or Harvard is going to be different than how we might look at somebody who graduated from a land grant institution, right? That's just the fact. And then also, what conferences do you belong to? What are you actively involved with on a year and annual basis? Where can we see your presence, right? Because of course, where you are present says this is something that you value. So where are you showing up, and how are you placing your values on the spaces that you're in? So I'm going to pass it on over to Jeff.
Hi, everyone. My name is Beth McCune. I am a master's student at Ball State, and I'm really excited to join you all this morning to talk about the academic branding process, and specifically how to navigate tenets of white supremacy. And when we think about decolonizing, we really have to confront and address white supremacist culture, because it is pervasive and it is really a driver of the systems that you will, function within academia. So it's important to understand them so that we can start deconstructing them, and hopefully build something back that's better than what we have now. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is from the work of Tima Okun and the writings of Decolonizing Racism works. I have listed a couple other individuals who do a lot of work on the decolonizing and anti-racism process for people, namely Desiree Stevens and Dr. Kimberly Douglas. And, just thinking about what all of this means for you is a huge step. And so I just want to acknowledge that now, because addressing white supremacy and white supremacist culture can be sticky and uncomfortable. And it's really great that you're here and interested in decolonizing your work. So to the first point, so there is 15 characteristics of white supremacy. I won't list all of them today, but there's just a couple that I wanted to touch on because I think that they are something that I have internally struggled with as a perceived white person working within an academic structure. And the first one that I really want to talk about is perfectionism. So this idea that there's only one right way to do something, and if you don't complete it in that way, people will look down on you because there is something wrong with not just the way that you did it, but you as a person. And that is a really important step that I had to take to kind of decolonize my brain and decolonize my brand, because it's so easy to get wrapped up in this idea that, you have to do it this way, you have to publish, you have to do X, Y, and Z to be a good academic and to be, valid in your field. And that's just not true. That's just not the case. As much as that feels very comfortable because that's like a laid out path for you, you don't have to do it that way if that doesn't speak to you. And this is a quote actually from that article that kind of breaks down the 15 core characteristics of white supremacy. Often internally felt, in other words, the perfectionist fails to appreciate their own good work, more often pointing out their faults or failures. And that quote goes on to say that you have a hard time, or you can have a hard time addressing the good that you do. And so in addition to the way to get out of this thinking that I have down there, I just want to acknowledge that thinking of yourself as a good person and thinking of the work as you're doing as good is an important step to take in this work of decolonizing, specifically as a white, as a perceived white person. And just to touch on what I have down here, so finding and creating a community that listens and supports your struggle. There is a lot of resources out there for you as an academic to be engaged in anti-racism work, to be engaged in decolonization work. And especially at your institution, I would implore you to take full advantage of those opportunities, because once you get out of academia, there's not necessarily like a multicultural center that you can go to for support. There's not necessarily a anti-racism group that you can lean on when you're, going through it. And so I would just implore you to really take advantage of those things while you have them now. Good, great. And then the next one that I really want to talk about kind of goes back to the perfectionism. They kind of work in tandem in my head, because individualism is very focused on, disconnecting from others. And I think perfectionism kind of reinforces that disconnection. So for white people, or white, perceived white people, you feel responsible for and think that you are qualified to solve problems on your own. And I think that the issue when you talk about trying to solve a problem on your own, or when you think that you are responsible for addressing issues in your field, and you think that nobody else is doing the work, that you're the only person, that is so toxic. That's toxic for you. That's toxic for the other people doing the work that is like tandem to yours, because you can't just do it all by yourself. A lit review is not made of all of your own words. You have to pull from other people. You have to reference what the people in your field are saying, and you have to understand, where they're coming from with that. And so this also gets carried out as a systemic issue for people of color, because they are blamed and shamed for acting to solve problems without checking in and asking for permission from white people. And that's something that white people have to work on as a group, as a culture. We have to work on it. And yeah. It's really easy to get caught up in if you are disconnected from others, like I said before. So Stephanie mentioned earlier, and we'll talk about it throughout this conversation, but networking with people it's part of why it's so important. It's not just because you want to talk to people and like get ahead. It's because you need other people. It's a fundamental need. And so so connecting with other academics that are also not just in your field necessarily, but in the process of decolonizing and also engaging in anti-racism work. It's really important in this process, and also can combat more of the like toxic traits that academia holds, because you'll see that it's not just you dealing with it. Academics in general just deal with these things, and networking and talking to other people in your field is so crucial to be successful and so important. So that about does it for me. I'm going to hand it off to Gabby Latarski.
There we go. Sorry, my computer froze and was not letting me unmute myself. Anyway, so I'm Gabby Latarski, and I'm kind of here to give you kind of some resources and ways to go about really building this kind of community that Stephanie and Beth have talked about, right? So we in that they've talked about really focusing on yourself, right? Focusing on what you're doing, and part of that is being authentic to who you are and not losing that in this whole process, right? And part of that comes from, knowing yourself, but also knowing where you fall in this whole process of, decolonizing the way you think and the academic process broadly, right? So first, know who you are and know where your comfortable engaging in that work, right? So if you're at a point in your path where you're not comfortable in rooms of old white men, that's fine. Don't be there. Those aren't the only places where people are engaging in discourse and knowledge production, right? If you're not comfortable there, you're not going to be doing your best work. You're not going to be authentic to yourself. Don't be there, right? Find folks who are doing similar research to you, organizations, right? For people who look like you and think like you. If you feel like there's not any kind of hub of people or resources that mesh with how you think and kind of any of your identities, make it up, start one, right? Really pull together this. So when you are kind of out and about, you know, networking and branding is all we hear anything about, right, in the academy. But it's important that you recognize while you're doing this to think about not networking the way people often think about it, but being relational and being reciprocal, right? So when we say being relational, this is really being concerned with actually building relationships with individuals, right? And these should be rooted in some genuine mutual relationships and not just being focused on what they can do for you, right? So really focusing on building a relationship and focusing on things that are reciprocal, right? So not focusing on how, focus on how the relationship you've built, right? You can help the individual, right? Not just how they can help you. Think about who you know and who you can introduce these individuals to, how your resources can help them, right? So when you're at conferences or, you know, engaging with other individuals, ask them who they want to meet, who they're interested in seeing there, and think about how you can maybe bridge the gap in some way for them, right? So in essence, we're talking about just genuinely caring about other folks because they're human beings, right? And we all kind of deserve that. Also, right? Increase opportunities, right? Don't just decrease them for everyone. So really we're talking about when you're climbing the ladder and whatever that means for you in your process, right? When you get up to the top, don't push everybody off, right? Don't push everybody off on your way up. Reach out a hand, right? Help them up. Turn the ladder into an elevator, right? Figure out how you can use everything that you've learned while you've been climbing to help everybody else, right? This really does help to demystify this process, especially when we're talking about individuals who, you know, haven't really been welcomed or accepted into these spaces, right? And with that, right, acknowledge that and be sure that you're holding spaces for your internal complexities and contradictions, right? And acknowledging them and honoring them because they're so important to not only your stories, but the way that you are as an academic, right? We've talked about this a lot, right? But be aware of your networks, right? Know who they comprise of, what they think, right? Because in some ways, you're an extension of the folks that you surround yourself with, right? So diversify your readings, right? Who you're reading, what you're reading, challenge the hierarchies where you can, right? You can't in every aspect because not everybody is there yet, right? But challenge them where you can. And lastly, I think this is incredibly important and often undervalued, right? But really don't isolate yourself from other fields and non-academic ideas and spaces and aspects of the world and networks, right? There's so much knowledge and experience and richness in these places, and often they tend to be these non-academic spaces are places where we find our inspiration and we're recharged, right? So maintaining those connections is vital. So those are kind of just the resources. And now I'm going to hand it off to Annie.
Before Annie goes, I wanted to just throw in something else that I thought about while you were speaking, Gabby, and that in like the importance of really mentoring incoming PhD students. I think of an experience I had last week where a first year student reached out to me and was really frustrated and really upset about some things going on in their experience. And because I feel like for the most part, a lot of us have successfully navigated these spaces as tough as they are, giving an opportunity to say, hey, here are some suggestions about maybe ways that can, alleviate some of the pressure and things like that that come with being a PhD student and just getting into what that even means. And so how to navigate that social pressure is something that's really key, but helping to mentor others incoming students is really key. Okay, Annie.
All right, can we go to the next slide, Stephanie? Cool, thank you. As everybody said, I'm Annie. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cincinnati, and I'm really excited to be here with everybody today. As everybody has said by this point, there are social pressures that reinforce both the culture of white supremacy and our need to adhere to it or comply to it, right? So we can think about Gabby was talking about, don't isolate yourself from other academic fields. And that can look like your advisor saying, well, you don't need a graduate certificate in women, gender, sexuality studies or something along those lines. We could also think of the process of going on the job market. Here is what your academic brand should look like. Here is your comments from your advisors. All of these reify the, this is what you should look like as an academic. This is who you should be, how you should portray yourself. And oftentimes that's in these white supremacist, very specific, here is who I am as an academic ways that we've been taught and we inevitably reinforce. And so part of my issue with all of this comes from having to be this one thing, as Beth was talking about, and being that one thing and being the only person to be it. And so talking to my advisor, she was like, I know you hate this entire process, but think of it like dating. And I said, what? And she looked at me and she was like, well, there's short-term and there's long-term dating. So this is who you are right now in this space, in this time. So there are times when you as PhD students or graduate students or academics or whoever you are might encounter spaces where you can't necessarily be totally radical as you may want to be, right? You may be in that room full of old white men and you may need for your safety or like your, I say safety meaning like for who you are as an academic, right? So like potentially getting a job, which is a big thing. You can't just be going burn everything down. I mean, you could, but the likelihood of you getting that job might decrease. So it's very dependent on space, place, and time. So who you are may your academic brand may change, and that's fine. And particularly around having a section, I am a medical sociologist, I am a sociologist of gender. I recommend thinking about these as dating, particularly, I'm a medical sociologist for my dissertation, but afterwards, will I necessarily be that? Who knows? And so particularly around elevator pitches, I think that this is where the practical implications come from all of this. So if you have multiple elevator pitches that depend on where you are, who you're talking to, and just kind of your current works, right? Because we all have multiple different works going on at the same time. So who you are as an academic can change. And I think that's a really big thing that I don't think necessarily comes up very often. Is that our identities are fluid, they are dynamic, they change And that's okay. That's good. It means you're growing. And the advice from a different advisor says, talk about the types of problems you study, not necessarily brand yourself as a medical sociologist. So, or as a, whatever you study. So you could say, I'm interested in the ways institutions influence personal access to XYZ, right? It's not necessarily about the medical sociology part. Is about the institution, the way institutions influence us. It's about the problems that you study, not necessarily about, I'm going to brand myself this way. And then the other thing that is told to me over and over and over again is avoid giving too much information, which I think is both productive and counterintuitive, in the sense of, if you are meeting a bunch of people, particularly at conferences like NCSA or bigger conferences like ASA, you don't necessarily have to be you don't have to sell yourself as this great, extravagant, whatever. They can know that from talking to you in an email, or you don't have to sell yourself as a particular brand. You can just say, I'm interested in this, and leave it at that. And then if you want to have a further conversation and deconstruct some of these white supremacy tenets, then that is more than okay to do in a space that is better for that. And again, I would just emphasize to find your comfort level with all of it, because there are times when you might not be comfortable completely saying, I don't want to have an academic brand, so I'm not going to. And I mean, there are times where I feel like that, but that's not always a plausible, reaction. And so I think it's about finding a community and a space where you can be like that, but also know the bounds of those spaces, right? So we're talking about networks, know where you are, know who you're with, and know where you can break down those barriers as well. And that's all I have. I think the next slide is our contact information. I'll hand it back to Steph.
Yeah, I mean, Annie, I think just to kind of go back to what you were talking about, I think it's really important. It's the reality, right? That as much as we would like to be able to show up 105% in a particular way, we cannot always. And one of the things that I know for myself that I've had some difficulty with is acknowledging, how do I acknowledge my own faith practice in an academic space? Particularly because I study religion, there is often a lot of questions about that. And so I had an opportunity a few weeks ago to name my faith, and I chose not to. And just because I wasn't necessarily the most comfortable in that moment, and I wasn't really sure how I wanted to show up in that moment with that. And so I left it out. But I think it's really key, like you're saying, don't feel shame about you're not ready yet to acknowledge or to do those types of things. It is, you're continuing to grow. Whereas on the other hand, I'm much more comfortable saying to people, I do academia, but I am an activist, right? And those two things go together, but for me in a very particular way, that for others it might not look the same. But I am doing academia as a form of activism and for the purpose of activism. And so thinking about those comfort levels is really, really key. As you can see, this is a picture of most of our committee. Annie is missing from this picture, but this is most of our committee from NCSA this past spring. This is our contact information and where we are located. I did not introduce myself at the beginning, but my name is Stephanie and I'm the chair right now for the student section. And so I wanted to just kind of open it up to some questions. I'll stop sharing the screen right now to see if there's any other things that we can kind of talk about as a committee that might be important for students to think about as we're thinking about constructing our brand, especially as we're so early in our careers. Nobody got anything? I got one. So I actually have two things. So from a very practical standpoint, because I feel like we talked a lot about a lot of things, what is the first step to someone who wants to decolonize their brand? if you had to offer some suggestion, what's the first thing that they should do?
I think that for me, getting curious about the ways that maybe I have a colonizer mindset is like a good first step, and just thinking about doing some looking into how other people have done that, and like meaningful ways that people of color have said that decolonizing happens, because that's who we want to be listening to when we're decolonizing our brand. And yeah, just getting curious about maybe what I have had before, and thinking about what I can have going forward.
Um, to add on to what Beth was saying, I would say maybe even before you start doing that, really check in with yourself, right? Like, where are you at? Are you really ready to do this, right? And that answer is going to vary. And if you're at the point where no, you're not ready, right? You can't do it for, whatever reason, being honest with yourself. Because if you jump in and you want to do this and you have the intention of doing it, but you're really not there yet, it's not going to be a fruitful process, right? So really checking in of, are you really ready? Why are you doing this? And then going it.
And then I'll just add one more thing in that it's an ongoing process, and it goes up and down and back and forth. And so I would say my initial thought process, like when you asked that question, Stephanie, was get mad. That was my response, because that was how this all started for me. Is I was told no on something, and I was like, well, I don't like that, because I don't find your reasoning sound. And so then it was like, all right, now I have to go back to the start of why I don't like this, and what is my brand now, and how do I rectify these two things? So I would just say, one, are you ready for it? And ask yourself that continually, and then say, okay, what do I do about it after that?
Yeah, that makes me think of Audre Lorde's uses of anger essay, where she talks about that concept of how do we use our anger to really push forth for social change, and doing that internalized check, right? That Beth and Gabby talked a lot about, for sure. The last question that I have, and of course, if y'all have other questions, we can talk through those too, is what are some resources that we can think of for folks who are looking for that community? Because again, what we understand is that in academia, we often get siloed into just like our little, corner of the world. And also, there are a lot of people who are academics and who are not academics who are doing really important work around decolonization. And so I have a couple of suggestions of resources that I utilize, but I'm really curious about what other resources you all utilize or suggest for people to check out if they're trying to figure out how to decolonize their brand.
I have a lot as well. I I think that it takes a lot to do this, and I think that no one way is going to like get you there. But I think that like I have like a two-pronged approach where I listen and engage with BIPOC people who are doing anti-racism work, and I'm listening to what they're saying they're seeing in people, and I try to process that, and then I take that information to other white perceived people, and I talk about it with them, and I talk through it with them. You do have to like intentionally create a group of like white people who, if you are white, and you want to engage with us, you do have to intentionally create a group who you are going to talk to about this. And you should not go and talk to BIPOC people unsolicited about this. It is not is our work to do. It is not their work to do. So don't do that. Number one, just don't do that. And then the group of BIPOC people that I listen to, there's a lot of resources, but the number one that I would suggest is that 15 characteristics of white supremacist culture. If you just type that in and type in Tima Okun, there's a couple of documents that will come up that will point you into a direction that you should be going in. And then if you're on social media, Desiree Stevens and Kimberly Douglas are two very influential people who I've followed, who do a lot of really good work and talk directly to white people and to lived BIPOC experience and try to challenge you on what you're doing. It is very uncomfortable, but if you want to start doing this work, then you absolutely should start doing it because it is very important. So.
Anybody else got any other resources?
No, but I think I have a question, actually. It kind of relates to all of this. And so I totally agree with Beth, and you have to find a community that is okay and willing, particularly if you're a white person trying to talk to other white people. Like, that's a hard thing to do. I think my question would be, to what extent can we engage with faculty? Like, do we know of faculty resources doing this work? Because I don't know if I've heard of it, but I also have a very small department. So yeah. And ultimately faculty are like the ones making the decisions. They're on the hiring committees. They are the ones, you know what I mean? So like, are there resources that are not just graduate students and or like random social media people, or you know what I mean? Like, do we see these networks in person for faculty?
Annie, do you mean, like, do faculty have their own anti-racist groups that they're engaging in?
Resources for graduate students is what I'm particularly talking about. Resources, like the faculty as our resources.
Mm.
Beth is just like,
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's hard, right? Like, when we think about it, I mean, a lot of us, we get into academia and a lot of our challenges are we're pushing up against those faculty who have been around for some time and like, this is the way things have always been. And it's hard to kind of move around those folks, right? Because they're typically in very powerful positions that make or break whether or not you progress through your program and you actually get out into the world. And so it becomes this like, how do you play the game well enough to get what you need here, but to not lose yourself in the process so that when you're out, you can do your own thing. So that when you get on the hiring committees, you can shift it and shake things up a little bit. But I mean, I want to say that we have a couple of folks on our campus that I would feel comfortable, say, reaching out to, building community with. But I think the resources that they offer are less kind of like institutionalized or structured and more on a kind of one-on-one basis. Like if I wanted to have a conversation with them, I could email them, reach out, those types of things. But to say that they have something like an office or a department or something like that within the institution, I don't think so. And I mean, I see that outside of academia. And so like some of the resources that I was thinking about, Academics for Black Lives. So they often do like almost, it feels almost structured in like a retreat or workshop type of way where they have one track for specifically for BIPOC academics, and they have another track for white folks. And what I think is interesting is that they usually don't charge the BIPOC community for attending those services, but they do for allies and accomplices who identify as white. And every so often they'll have just like a speaker series and those types of things where they're talking about resources. And so that one I feel like is more institutionalized. One of the things that we've done on my campus with grad students and with faculty in other departments is we've done a restorative circle. So we meet bi-weekly Usually during the warmer months, we try to meet outside in like our arboretum where there's like some nature and those types of things. And we incorporate some like body movement, body work in terms of yoga and those types of pieces. But we also just talk about, you know, our lives and how we are negotiating that. The last session that we did last week was talking about how do we bring our ancestors with us in the work that we do, right? And so that being a very decolonized type of space where, you know, it's important for us to consider the legacy of our work in particular ways. And then also like there are some random social media people that I know, like, so the NAP ministry, you know, that talks about this idea of rest, right? And how it is anti-capitalist or anti-establishment to make sure that you rest, and that by being intentional about how you choose to show up and how you rest, you know, really does a lot of work to decolonize your own understanding of the work that you do in the spaces that you operate in. But I think that's a really good question, Annie. I don't know that I have any answers for that part.
I don't think I do either. And I don't necessarily know if anybody would, but it was just interesting because we're talking about building these networks and building these communities, but it sounds largely as if we're talking to other grad students about this process rather than either creating organizations or navigating these spaces with the old white men, as Gabby put it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wonder if that's partially, if that onus is on us as the younger generation of scholars to make that space for folks that are coming after us, even though ideally, like, we would love to have Angela, all of us would love to have Angela Davis on our campus, right? You know, or David Stovall or something like that, you know, people who are out doing that work and very visibly are decolonizing. But in the meantime, you know, maybe it's just us.
One of the things that sounds maybe counter to what we should be doing, but if you're teaching classes, listening to your students, right? They're not always the best in classes themselves, as we all know, but I think when you're really listening to what they're saying, I think in some ways that can help and educate in different ways, right? Depending on the demographics of where you're teaching, who you're teaching, and really listening, right? Because just because we're graduate students does not mean we know everything or have all the answers, and neither do faculty.
Snaps, for sure. Any other questions or anything that we could consider about this concept and this topic? No? All right. Well, thank you all so much for watching this recording of our fall session for the year 2022. We are going to be working on preparing some different activities and sessions and things like that between now and when the conference happens. This should be up on our social media and our website within the next couple of weeks. But in the meantime, if you have any questions for us, definitely please reach out via any of the emails that we showed you all earlier. But thank you again so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.